Welcome to the Sacred Stew. I am your host, James, and this is my co-host, Anthony. And you have arrived at your destination for all things dealing with Germanic theology, paganism, history. And tonight, we have a very interesting conversation. We're going to discuss the Christianization of the Germanic people, the history behind it, some of the machinations that were happening during those times when the conversion happened. And we're going to really jump into this. Before we get to this topic, though, there's a few things that I want to mention or bring up. Last week's episode with Folkwood Lardagifa was a great episode, and there was many topics that we touched the surface on the Anglo-Saxon tradition. If you have not listened to that episode, please do so. But before we jump into the topic tonight, I do want to ask you, Anthony, did you have any follow-up thoughts or ideas or anything about our conversation last week with Folkweird?
Honestly, I wouldn't say really anything in follow-up. I just think he did a really great job of highlighting the strong similarities and connections between the Norse, continental, Germanic, and Anglo-Saxon traditions. And from somebody that follows the Anglo-Saxon perspective, really just articulated in a different way what we've said about it all being the same thing, just a different accent as far as our faith and spiritual tradition goes.
Yeah, I really found the conversation about the elves to be something that we should probably go a little bit further in another episode, because I think they're overlooked in our tradition a lot. And I think that homage should certainly be paid to them. And I don't think that we appreciate them in who they are, their stature, as we should.
The elves are something I know almost nothing about. And just a question popped in my head, but we'll freaking save that for that episode.
Let me ask you if you had any feedback about that episode last week, because that was a popular episode. It really was a hit. We had a crap ton of listens to that episode, and it's by far the most widely listened to episode that we've released, and it's every day it's just growing and growing and growing in listens.
Yeah, I was super happy with the way people tuned in and the overall feedback we got. I mean, there were some people that definitely could have kept their opinions to themselves, but no, I mean, I really liked it, and that was our first interview, and I think we did a good job. As far as some of the criticisms we've gotten, I recognize that I need to work on saying and like a lot.
Yeah, it's actually, we should point out that almost all of our feedback has been really positive about our podcast. The little bit of feedback that we have had, which has been negative, is really just about our, I guess, the use of using as a filler between sentences whenever we're speaking. But I would point out that a lot of times it's not just necessarily a filler, because you can listen to very experienced speakers that will at times use that as a nuance in what they're saying, because a lot of times you're thinking on the fly, and using gives you a moment to pause as you're formulating the correct words to say to express yourself. So, but it's a valid criticism. As we get better with each episode, I'm sure that our presentation will get a little bit better. But like we pointed out in previous episodes, this is just a podcast that started out as you and I having conversations over the phone, and we just thought it was a good idea to record them so other people can listen to them and perhaps get something from it that would help them in their journey and in their connection to the gods and the folk. We don't sit here and write out notes, of each point topic that we're going to go over, because we want this to be a fluid conversation. And as you mentioned before, Anthony, I think you mentioned everybody that you talk to really loves the format of how we do this podcast.
Yeah, I mean, everybody that I've talked to, and I am not talking down on anybody that does a presentation format, but there are so many people that do it that way that I just feel like having a conversation is something that isn't being done. And I feel like it's a lot more friendly to people that don't learn from a presentational format, or people that just want something a little bit more entertaining than slides and bullet points.
And the point isn't so much to give a presentation of something, but rather to discuss the topics. Yes, to inform people with information, but also to develop our own understandings between each other. And we share this conversations that you and I used to have privately with others by recording it, so they have an opportunity to grow with us as we're learning and as we're discussing these very important topics to our spirituality, our faith, and our understanding of our history.
Yeah, because I mean, like speaking from personal experience, before we met, I had been practicing 7-8 years, and then as soon as we started talking, that's when I really realized how little I knew. Like, I knew I didn't know everything, but the more I talked to you and started reading some of the books that you suggested, and just through our conversation, I started learning a lot more. And so, yeah, I feel like there's the likes again. I just think this is a good thing, all things considered. You know what I mean?
Right. Well, and it's making sense of that alphabet soup of Germanic paganism that so many people seem to be eating nowadays, where, you mentioned it before, how it's just a mishmash of all these things, because they have all these sporadic stories from this place and this place, but most of them have not been able to connect the dots with the entirety of the epic, of the story of our history and that of the gods themselves. One of the main proponents of this alphabet soup paganism, I hear them constantly criticize people of our specific spiritual faith and understanding by saying that we are Christianizing our gods, and that we are essentially damaged because of this imprinting that we've had from Christianity on the folk. And while that is true to a certain degree, I believe that people that have that opinion take it a little too far, because now they essentially become agnostic, where they don't believe in the reality of the gods. They don't believe they're real entities and real beings. I've seen that meme, Anthony, on the internet, where there's two people standing on each side of the number 6 or the number 9. And one person says, yeah, that's the number 6. And the other person says, well, no, that's the number 9. You're wrong. And the other person says, well, if you come stand and see it from my perspective, it's the number 6. And vice versa, the number 9. See, the problem with that meme is it actually highlights a very big thing that people overlook, is that it's not about perspective, but it's about understanding the context of what is written there. So let's say, for example, we have somebody that travels from a village, and on this trail and during his travels, he writes the number 9. Now, he's writing this number as a mile marker of how many miles it is from his village. Of course, those traveling on that path may not know that. So, although perspective is important, the context of it actually gives it its true meaning. And that's what we're trying to do here with this conversation that you and I are having and sharing with other people, is give context to this alphabet soup of paganism that people seem to practice today. Does that make sense, Anthony?
Makes perfect sense to me because it is
Preaching to
very
the
much an
choir.
alphabet soup.
And it's been made of alphabet soup entirely. So tonight, we're going to get into something that's really important for folk to understand. And we're going to discuss the Christianization of the Germanic folk. And I'm going to provide some information for people. You can study it for yourself. There's histories written about much of this. There will be some speculation in there, as you know, a lot of times fine details and intimate thoughts of people were not always necessarily written about. So some of it is speculated by actions or deeds or things that happened. And I want people to take this conversation and really, really try to understand the machinations that were transpiring over 2,000 years ago against the Germanic folk, because understanding that is going to help us, number one, heal as a folk in general, but spiritually our soul that's connected to each other. And then two, it's also going to help us teach our own children about this history so that our folk in the future don't fall prey to this. So with that said, Anthony, I know that we've talked a lot in the past and made references to the forced conversion of our folk. When people say that, when you say that, when I say that, I'm interested in what you think that means.
If I was going to sum it up, I would put it like this: that at some point in time, the Christian church decided that they wanted to expand their territories, and first they sent priests to try to peacefully convert. And when that didn't work, because they have a conversion mandate from their God, they started to plot, and they found weak leaders that were unsecured in their rulership, and said, well, if you convert, your rulership is ordained by God. In the areas where that didn't work, they found somebody that was willing to convert, that they could control, and they got that person into power. And then once they had these leaders of their faith in positions to exert control, they started outlawing the traditions. And when we say forcibly converting, I believe his name is, I'm going to slaughter it, Raud the Strong, where when he said no, they killed him by shoving a snake down his throat. And there's another guy, I'm trying to find my papers, but there's another guy that when he chose not to convert, they put hot coals on his stomach till it exploded. So that's what I mean by forcible conversion, through subversion and threats of death.
Yes, generally speaking, everything you said is true. And there are very specific instances like this that we can point to. The massacre by Charlemagne of the Gothes, the Jarls of the Saxons. The massacre of Verdun is always on my mind when I think about this. And I hear, that often when it's said, so and so converted to Christianity and was baptized, what that actually means is that they drowned the people. When they say 500 people were baptized after a battle and converted. But the history of it is actually a lot more interesting. And I wouldn't call it a conspiracy theory per se, because it is more historical fact that is known. Many ancient historians have written about, some of the things that took place. So when we begin the story of the conversion of the Germanic folk to Christianity, we have to go back all the way to the times of Jesus himself, and even a little bit back before that. In the Old Testament, which is a set of historical documents that detail the history of the Israelites, it's mentioned in numerous occasions of battles, great battles that they had with lots of different people throughout the Middle East and Southeast Europe and South or Northwest Asia. We know those folk as Indo-Europeans, which were cousin folk of the Germanic people. And a lot of those Indo-European folk did migrate eventually into Europe itself, central Germania as we would know it, and became part of those bloodlines that existed. But when we talk about the conversion of Christianity of the Germanic people, we have to begin with Jesus. The reason why we have to begin with Jesus is because we have to understand what was actually going on at that time. Rome, as we know from various Roman histories, we know of Herman the German, that was under, the tutelage of Roman emperors and such, and rose to great rank. We can look at his story as an example of what actually was the tradition when people were warring, is they would exchange hostages. Herman the German himself was a child and was given as a hostage to the Romans. You know about the story of Herman the German, right?
If I'm remembering correctly, he eventually became, if not a general, a high-ranking officer. And when the Romans one of the times the Romans went to invade Germania, he took his forces, trained the Germans in Roman tactics, and handed Rome the biggest defeat they had gotten almost ever.
Yeah, no, exactly right. He led a coalition of Germanic tribes around, I think it was around just during the time of, if the calendar is correct, when Jesus was 9 years old. So around 9 AD, Herman the German led Germanic tribes to victory over Rome in the Battle of the Teutoburg Forest. This is important because Herman the German, he was, or as he was known to the Romans, Arminius, he was known as essentially a person to be trusted by the Romans. They had given him his own legions, and he was tasked with essentially overseeing specific tribes within the Germanic people. So I just want to put that into context, because during the same time that Jesus is alleged to have lived, there were battles going on between Rome and the Germanic folk. At the same time, there were battles going on in the Middle East as well, where the various Jewish tribes were revolting against Rome. This is important to understand because it is through these various engagements that the Romans had in various parts of the globe that a vast conspiracy began to happen. Our folk, the Indo-Europeans in general, were known in the Bible, and many of them were called the eternal enemies of the Israelites. Not the Germans per se were called the eternal enemies of the Israelites, but they were cousins of tribes that were in constant war and battle with the Israelites for hundreds and even thousands of years. These are battles that took place and dates back all the way to Egyptian times. Now, we could do a deep dive in another episode about this specific topic and the connection of the Egyptians and the Indo-Europeans and marriages and such between pharaohs, and exactly what happened during the exodus of the Israelites from Egypt into their quote-unquote promised land. But I don't really want to delve into that too much just because of time. But just understand that there was conflict that was arising. And during the Jewish history, there was many times when they went to great wars. Many people that are familiar with some of the biblical stories will recall that the Jewish people, the Israelites, were defeated around 500 BC by the Babylonians, and then they were taken from essentially what is today modern Israel, but was known at the time as Palestine, to the Babylonians' homelands. During this time that they are in captivity, as the biblical history tells us, the Persians, I believe the dynasty or the empire was called the Achaemenids dynasty or empire, and they were Indo-European folk. They were people descended from some of the same ancestors that we're descended from, although it's a different branch. And they ended up coming and defeating the Babylonians, and over time, a matter of hundreds and hundreds of years, they ended up allowing the Israelites to go back to Palestine. When they did this, this is when the various sects of Judaism arose. And in the Bible, we hear of different sects by the name of Sadducees, also the Pharisees. People familiar with the New Testament probably recall that Pharisees were the ones that were like the law keepers. They were very literal by the book, follow the Judaic law. They're also the ones that really revered the Talmud and the oral traditions. And that specific tradition of the Pharisee evolved eventually into what we know as Rabbinic Judaism today. It's important to understand these sects because there was a war during the time of the Roman occupation. At the same time, they're going to war with the Germanic folk. And the Jewish sects, some of them believe in like a messianic person that will come in the future to save their people and to restore the temple and the priesthood. And this messianic idea was very common in the Middle East. We see the same traditions by almost all Semitic religions. The Muslims, they believe in the messianic message that there will be essentially a savior that will come at a future date to save them. And so this tradition was very active at the time in Rome. And because the temple of Jerusalem had been destroyed, there was a lot of variance between Jewish sects, and there was infighting. And they didn't like the Roman occupation of Palestine. They wanted to control their own people, and they wanted to get rid of the Romans. So Joseph was a Jewish historian, in the history books as we know him today, he was known as Flavius Josephus. He was a Pharisee. And he actually was a general among the Jewish people, and he led a revolt against Rome. The Romans were successful at defeating this Jewish insurrection at the time. And keep in mind that Josephus lived somewhere around the era of 37 to 100 years in the Christian era. So he was right at the end, maybe right after the alleged Jesus character. And he was captured by the Romans, and he ended up actually allegedly having this vision about the Roman emperor that he was captured by in these battles, that he would become a great leader and that he was to follow him. Very convenient that this happened, of course, at the end of the battle when Josephus loses and he's captured and was probably destined to be killed, that he has this vision by God about how great this Roman leader is and that he should essentially be his slave or be the person that works for this Roman leader.
Yeah, that timing was impeccable. Like, I don't think I could have been more on point.
So Josephus essentially was defeated by Vespasian, and essentially has this vision by God, quote unquote, that Vespasius would become this great leader and that he was to essentially help him. Very convenient. During this time that he's with Vespasius and his family arises, there's also conflict going on with the Germanic folk throughout Germania. We're dealing with the 1st century in the Christian era. So we know from Tacitus's writings in, I think it was 96 AD or 92 AD, where he's writing about Germania. He's writing about the folk. He's writing about their beliefs. He's writing about the people from there. So we know that there's a convergence of information from two different sides that is happening. So one of the individuals that was involved in the creation of the Gospels was Josephus, Flavius Josephus, this historian, the person that was a general, was defeated by the Romans, Vespasian, and ends up having this miraculous vision from God that he's supposed to help Vespasian. He becomes this historian per se. Now, there are people that think that Josephus' writings are literal truth of things that were happening. But there's also historians that believed Josephus himself actually wrote some of the Gospels of the Bible as we know it today. And that he did this in league with Vespasian to help him control the Jews and to also solidify the rule of Vespasian, because he saw it as a religion that they saw the early Christians as a threat to Rome, and the Pharisees themselves, whom Josephus was, he was a priest by not just birth, but he was a studied Pharisee. They did not like this quote unquote new version of Judaism that was arising. And to help aid Vespasian and at the same time help the Pharisees overcome this division that was happening with the sectarian division between the Jews, some historians say that they conspired together and actually created the character of Jesus. I'm not going to say if that's, true or not true. I do not know. But it's irrelevant whether Jesus was a real person or whether he was an invented character of Josephus. But with that said, at the exact same time that this is happening during the first century, you have different Roman generals and leaders and such that are vying to try to control all of Rome. Because the great Caesars, essentially their time had come. And what better way to do this than by having a religion where you could control people by a unified view of one God. Years later, we see, I believe the name is pronounced Decius. He is the first Roman that actually instituted around 225 in the Christian era, where he mandated that any person under Roman authority must worship the Roman gods. This is important to understand because this was happening during the wars between the Romans and the Germanic folk. The first Germanic folk that converted to Christianity were the Gothic folk. The Goths, the Visigoths, the Vandals. And a lot of that actually happened because they were living in Roman areas. And after battles, often peace treaties would be had. They would exchange hostages. They would get great jarls' children. And over time, they would make them essentially believe the state religion of Rome. When this first began to happen, much of it was still pagan in belief as far as Rome is concerned. But by this time, Christianity and this version that they call Arianism, which is not to be confused with Aryan, like the Aryan migration, but rather to deal with Arianus, who taught a form of Christianity that was a really early form. Some people today kind of relate the Jehovah Witnesses and their beliefs to be that of a very similar nature as what the Arians have believed. Now, there was a lot of conversions happening just simply because of people living under Roman law, and when they lived in specific areas, they would have to worship the gods of the leader of that specific area per Roman law. So let's fast forward a little bit. There's battles in the Germanic lands. The Goths convert. They move southeast and westward, begin converting to this new form of Christianity that didn't even exist during the first century after Christ, allegedly. And there was various sects within this new Jewish religion that was created. And they were able to force people by hostage exchange and also by law that they must worship the Roman gods. About 100 years later, Constantine comes to power. What do you know about him?
I believe Constantine was the one that officially changed the Roman religion from their traditional ethnic polytheism to Christianity.
He is the personage that made Christianity the official religion of Rome and all of its subjects. Now, Constantine himself actually was not even baptized until his death. So there's some speculation of whether or not he really truly converted to Christianity, although his mother was also one of the Arian converts to Christianity. But there's a story about this conversion. So before Constantine, the Roman Empire was ruled by a team of different rulers in different areas. They had different regions and deputies, and there was 2 emperors and such. But they divided Rome into areas of influence over each regime would control. So there was a battle between essentially these emperors of wanting to reunite all of Rome. During the time of Constantine, there was a threat of invasion by the Persians, by the Germanic tribes, and also by the Goths. And although the Goths were the first folk to actually convert to Christianity, they were also the first folk that were openly in battle with Christianity. During this time set, there was problems with food distribution among people. There was problems with labor for different things that the Roman Empire was building. Problems with generating and growing crops. And essentially, the empire itself was slowly collapsing because it wasn't able to feed itself.
Ripe for subversion. See eerie parallels to today.
Exactly. We can use these exact same parallels because this keeps happening as a repeated pattern over time. So, as Christianity arose in the Middle East, it was a sect of Judaism originally, a sect that derived itself from the Pharisees, which we know today as Rabbinic Judaism, Talmudic Judaism. And what ended up happening was it took some of the beliefs and characteristics of other dualistic religions that were initially Indo-European in nature, like Zoroastrianism, and essentially which had a dichotomy of good and evil, opposing pairs, good and bad, light and dark, spirit, body, etc. And they incorporated that into this Christianized Jewish faith. In the first 2 centuries, the practice of Christianity essentially gained footholds in a very small area of Rome, and the majority of its practitioners were more so in the Mediterranean area. Now, by the time of Constantine, the practice of Christianity had expanded into areas in Europe, but it was somewhat held in check because of specific laws of Roman emperors. As I mentioned earlier, Decius required that all Roman citizens were to worship the state gods as part of the war against the Goths themselves. Now, this didn't exactly have to do with Christianity. It had more so to do with the war with the Germanic people. They didn't want the Germanic people to worship their gods.
So we've got a continuing thread.
Correct. Now, a lot of people try to say, well, this was because of the Christians. Yes and no, it was because of both. It was because they wanted to conquer both. Now, Constantine comes, and in 325, he calls a council, what is known today as the Council of Nicaea, and he has all of these religious elders from all around. Now, this is where my tinfoil hat comes on a little bit because nobody really knows, like, the innermost working thoughts of Constantine. But we can see the political machinations in motion by what happens. Constantine abandons the Roman gods, at least publicly, declares Christianity to be the religion of Rome, although he was never baptized until he was on his deathbed. But apparently, allegedly, this happened because he was going to go to war with...
I just want to add that if I was a leader suffering from spiritual deficiency, I'd want it to be under Christian theology.
Well, yeah. And there's a reason why, because he knew that this would be the only way that he would be able to subjugate people under one rule. So there's a story about Constantine when he was younger, and he was trying to secure his own power and his own rise. He rose through the ranks. The story of his birth had to do with, I think it was a Roman general had went to some inn as he traveled, and he had taken a woman at a tavern that was the daughter of the tavern owners that was really young. And essentially the next day, according to the mythology of it, Constantine's father told the innkeeper, hey, here's my cloak. This woman will have my protection. If she has child, be sure to send word to me, right? And so, as the story goes, she was pregnant, and then that is Constantine's alleged rise to fame through the ranks was through his father, where he comes from. But as he's rising through the ranks, there was another Roman by the name of Maxentius, which believed that he, according to the prophecies, would be victorious of uniting all of the Romans under his rule. Constantine opposes him and decides that that he will go face him in battle. Well, a lot of Constantine's men, according to the histories that we have, were very worried about going to war against Maxentius because they are very superstitious. And Maxentius had claimed to essentially receive the oracles where he would be the victor. And so the day after this, Constantine raises his army and he goes and speaks to his army, and he again has a miraculous vision. And this is where the Cairo symbol comes from. Have you ever heard of the Cairo symbol?
No.
So some people have attributed the Cairo symbol to be the beginning of the letters of the name of Christ. And it's what he allegedly received in this vision. But it's very, very opportunistic that he would receive this vision just days after Maxentius has his alleged vision as well. And it's more likely that Constantine was essentially trying to ease the fears of his own men to let him know that they would be victorious, and to essentially try to boost their morale to go into battle. Whether or not he really had this vision or not, who knows? I wasn't there. But it's very opportunistic that this happened at this specific time. However, Constantine was victorious in battle against Maxentius. But at this time, he was still pagan. And it wasn't until years later when he decrees Christianity to be the official religion of Rome. You have anything to throw in here?
Definitely, I don't know. I think of visions, and like visions are fickle. What I wouldn't give for a time machine to just be a fly on the wall when all this was happening.
I would jump back to the conspiracy of it is essentially, so there are some historians, if we jump back to Josephus and Flavius, Vespasian, and that there is a convergence of what I think is likely to have happened. And I should probably give a little bit more commentary here instead of just stating, the different events that transpired. but now everybody has context to the story a little bit. So let's break this down a little bit. We have Josephus, which was a Pharisee during the first century of the Christian era. Now remember, according to the Bible, Jesus didn't like the Pharisees. Remember when he went into the temple, overturned the tables, and scared off all the Pharisees with the stick?
Yeah.
So these are the people that we're talking about.
Okay.
Josephus is captured after a huge battle and revolt against the Romans, essentially made into a slave for the Roman emperor of that region, and rises to eventually actually being adopted by that family. Josephus's original name was Josephus Matthias, whereas the name he is known now in history books is Flavius Josephus, and that was the adopted name of the emperor that he was enslaved to.
If you can't beat them, join them.
Well, we see this in politics throughout history, though, where we have a group of people that infiltrate the very highest ranks. They begin propaganda to get people to believe certain things. We see this today with the various political battles that are going on throughout the world, where different sides are twisting information to try to convince people to follow certain ideas and concepts. This isn't a new mechanism that we're using today. This has been around for thousands of years. People have written about these things. I mean, Tacitus himself in his books tells us that he's writing these books about these different people so they can eventually conquer those people. That was the purpose of it. So putting on my tinfoil hat for a minute, we have a Judaic Pharisee that's in the inner chambers with one of the Roman leaders. And then all of a sudden, this Judaic Pharisee is adopted into the family, is the right-hand man, writes a history, and in this history, he mentions a character by the name of Jesus. As I pointed out earlier, some people say that he actually made that character up in order so they could subdue the Jewish uprisings of some of these other sects. I would theorize that what was actually happening was you have the Pharisees wanting to solidify their influence over the Jewish people, because at this time there was a lot of different Jewish sects that were arising. The main ones were the Sadducees, the Pharisees, and the Essenes, but there was various ones, and the most troublesome were the Messianic ones, the ones that believed that there was a Messiah that was going to come and save them. So I would theorize that Josephus is working with the Roman leader in order to subjugate Jewish sects that would not adhere to the Pharisaic rule of the Jewish people, to try to essentially leverage himself and other Pharisees to have the power over the people. At the same time, if we turn back, and kind of get a little biblical here, we have, most of us come from Christian upbringing, so we know of Paul the Apostle, who also had a quote-unquote miraculous vision, and he becomes the first alleged proselytizer to Gentiles, specifically the people in Galatia. So Galatia is what we know today of as the Armenians, right? They are also Indo-European folk. So Paul begins preaching to these people to convert them over time. Now, if you know your biblical studies, New Testament specifically, and also some of the historical things written about Paul, we know that he was also a Pharisee of the Judaic sect. Big coincidence.
I don't believe in coincidences.
By the time of Constantine in the Council of Nicaea in 325, he orders all of these different religious scholars of Judaism and Christianity to essentially come to this council and provide him all these different arguments. And what would you know? Out of all of these arguments that are being presented to him about which one is the correct belief or faith or whatever that may be, he chooses to canonize the version of Christianity that was preached by the Pharisee Paul, the quote-unquote apostle, whom focused heavily on trying to convert the Indo-European people to that belief system. Now, Constantine was a very smart man, and he knew the Roman law, and he knew the reasons why his predecessors prior to him had implemented laws to try to solidify their governance of the people, that they had to worship the Roman gods. And thus, when Constantine made his decree that Rome shall follow this version of Christianity, there was a schism that actually happened because some people wanted to, well, actually, most people wanted to follow the Arianism form of Christianity. And essentially what that form of Christianity taught was that Jesus was not God, that he was a man, a teacher, or a prophet. But Constantine chose to go with a very different form of Christianity, a form of Christianity that was even different than his own mother's. And there could be no other reason, in my eyes, for him to do this, except that he knew that this form of Christianity would enslave the people to the rule of the Roman emperor. We can see this throughout the Christian texts very blatantly with passages such as, "Render unto Caesar what is Caesar's."
Well, and this also gets that slippery slope that we deal with today, where there are a lot of people that have this point of view that religion is only a tool to control the masses. And so to have any religious belief enslaves you or allows the people trying to oppress you to do what they want to do.
That's a very true statement, because religion as we understand it today, or as most people understand it today, that's exactly what it does. And it's a slave mentality of just accepting your physical and situational conditions because you have hope of something better after you die. No matter how bad your life is, or no matter how bad the Roman emperors treat you, you're going to have a great afterlife. Just believe this. Just keep going. Just keep the faith. But there is a difference between the religion of our ancestors and of our native faith and that of Christianity. So when we speak of religion in this way, it is something very different, because for us, the only time that there would be a single leader of the folk would be when there would be war. And that leader would be selected from all of the jarls. And that's because they understood that in order to successfully battle other people, they had to be under one leadership to do so. But as soon as that war was over, that individual that was raised to that rank was no longer in that position. And then it would go back to a council of jarls or a council of elders that would make a democratic vote, essentially. And in most Germanic law codes, this usually had to be done unanimously. Or they would compromise until there was a unanimous decision. And sometimes this lasted for days and weeks, months, until, such decisions were unanimous. What we're seeing with the rise of Christianity and what happened with Constantine and his predecessors before him is they wanted to solidify the idea of this universalist religion that they could control as the emperors, as the official religion of the state, and that essentially anything that they said had to be obeyed. Do you see the difference between the two?
The Romans were looking for a top to bottom rulership, and our ancestors, not quite a bottom to top form of leadership, but except for very rare circumstances, it was never just one person. And in doing that, it allowed more freedom to our people.
Correct. And also keep in mind that Constantine had to destroy the gods of the Germanic folk. So he chooses a version of Christianity that's argued among many scholars that were at the Council of Nicaea and even afterwards. He chooses a form that accepted Gentiles, as they call them, which is a direct reference to the Indo-European and Germanic people. And to do this, at the same time, we cannot forget or keep out of our minds that essentially what we have is Judaic Pharisees that are advising them to do these things.
So that makes me wonder where the split happened to where we now see like Jews and Christians essentially being two very different, distinct groups. I mean, that's not a topic for this, but that is an interesting train of thought.
That is an interesting train of thought, but not a topic for this discussion. Maybe in another episode, but I doubt I really want to delve too much into Judaic history and how that split actually happened. So the conspiracy goes really deep because it involves a sectarian conspiracy from foreign people, not of our folk, with histories that are, although interwoven, doesn't really have anything to do with us on the inner conflicts happening between them. But we do see the convergence and influence and then the eventual Christianization of Europe because of these machinations that took place after this Jewish uprising with Rome.
So essentially, because Constantine chose this specific form of Christianity that allowed for the conversion of non-Jewish folk, that laid the foundation for, since there was already the rule that if you're under Roman control, you follow the Roman gods. By adopting this Christian faith, that religion is no longer one of a specific group of people, and with the mandate to basically destroy the idols and any other gods out there, it gave them not only a political mission, but a quote unquote religious mission to dominate and convert other groups of people.
Correct. Now, don't get me wrong, conversion of the Gothic people was happening prior to Constantine. As I mentioned, his own mother had been converted. And so it wasn't necessarily all by rule, but a lot of it just had to do with the large influx of Goths into Roman areas during the first, second, and third centuries after in the Christian era, and becoming under Roman law and practice and custom, they would have to participate in things. And then we also have marriage exchanges that are happening, hostage exchanges, and often these marriages that would happen would be for political reasons. And for example, when a battle happens, in order to have peace, they would exchange hostages and often get the children of jarls and leaders of our folk, and they would raise those children to be Christian. Then they would send them back into the folk with these Christian beliefs. And then also at the same time this is happening, you have the Roman hostages that are Christian now in the homes of our folk, teaching them this new Jewish religion that is being disseminated to our people. So the conversion wasn't all forced. Some of it was just subversion. With the marriages, one could say that, well, that doesn't mean that the husband would convert. But a lot of the time, what would happen is those women in those marriages would refuse to consecrate or quote unquote have sex with the husband until he was baptized.
I mean, I believe that was what Eric the Red's wife did. Poor guy.
And baptism, even though it records like baptism and things like this, that didn't actually always meant that they abandoned the old gods, especially when these things were first happening.
I was just going to say, because there's also, I mean, I don't know if this was happening in the same time that we're talking about, but there were also areas where you couldn't do business if you were not a baptized Christian. So there were a lot of merchants that superficially got baptized just so they could do business in certain areas.
Yeah, that was later on in the conversion period. But yes, that is definitely true as well. So what we've kind of discussed and went over here is how it all began and the machinations employees that happened in historical context of the beginning of the Christianization of our folk. That's exactly how it happened. Now, at the same time that we see Constantine dying, we do see the strength of the German people raising. Wars with the Romans continued, and we have the first kingdom of the Germanic folk that arise, the Merovingians, and this would be the next stage of the Christianization of the Germanic people. Do you know anything about the Merovingians at all?
Only that I've got some blood ties to them. I know the name.
Yes. So the Merovingians, I also have blood ties to them as well. And unfortunately, after, I believe it was the third king, who was Clovis, he converted to Roman Catholicism. Now, what's interesting about Clovis, though, in his conversion is we have to remember that we have Germanic folk that are living in Roman territories, and they're still battling for glory. They're still battling for new lands. They're still battling, all sorts of people, not just Romans, other Germanic people as well. But Clovis was a staunch believer in the gods of our ancestors. In fact, so much so, he had a Christian wife as well, but he was so much so a staunch believer in the gods that his wife wanted to have their son be baptized as a Christian, and Clovis absolutely refused, right? Well, his wife ends up baptizing their son without his permission behind his back. He finds out about it, and then shortly after that baptism, that son dies. Clovis blames the death on her baptizing him. So that added an additional resolution to him where he would not accept Christianity. She did this with his second son as well. And I can't remember if the second son died or not after the baptism. Part of me wants to say yes, but I'm not 100% sure. My memory is not recalling it precisely. However, he remained a staunch believer in the old faith until he had to go to war with another Germanic tribe. Now, Clovis and his father before him had very good relations with the Romans. They lived in Roman territory. The Romans often aided and assisted him. And by Clovis's time, the Roman Catholic Church now existed, and they are trying to expand their power. And it wasn't until a battle that Clovis had with this Germanic tribe in 496 in the Christian era, where he is facing sure defeat. His forces are being subdued, and miraculously, allegedly, he has a vision. And the vision tells him that if he converts or if he believes in Jesus, that he'll be granted victory. And so on the battlefield, as the story is told, Clovis converts to Christianity. And miraculously, he wins the battle. What are your first thoughts about that, Anthony?
That sounds like super convenient timing.
There's all these visions happening at really strange times.
A lot of divine intervention, allegedly.
Well, what we do know is that history is written by the victors. I've heard the nuance of his story, right? Not necessarily true, but it is his version of the story. What I believe is more likely, because we see this happen with even pagans, where the Roman Catholic Church will make saints of pagans themselves, like Joan of Arc. She was a pagan. You know, she worshipped the old gods. Yet they weren't able to successfully get rid of her folklore among the people. So instead of getting rid of that, the way that they wrote the story is that she converted to Catholicism and became a saint and had visions from God. This is a tactic that the Roman Catholic Church used on multiple occasions for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years. So, I'm going to put my tinfoil hat back on, and I'm going to call bullshit on this conversion. And what I think is more likely to have happened is that because Clovis and his family were clearly aligned with the Romans, that the Roman Catholic Church essentially had told him that if he converts publicly, that they will aid him in his battle against the Germanic people. And I believe wholeheartedly that's most likely what happened. And he conquered those people. The Merovingians spread their rule. They were a very successful monarchy. They are the ones that the Franks essentially come from. And this is how the battle of Christianity and our old faith came to a real head, where the fighting really began. We see shortly after this a huge influx of Germanic people migrating north during the same time frame, which is, I'm going to bring up our episode from last week because we talked a little bit about the English tradition, the Anglo-Saxon tradition, and how they migrated and such. There was also in this past week, there was a new DNA study that came out. I'm not sure if you saw it, Anthony, or not, but it conclusively proves that during the 4th, 5th, and 6th, 7th centuries, there was a huge migration of Germanic people into England, and the DNA subsets in the general English population is very Germanic. Did you see that study?
I saw the video for it. I haven't had a chance to watch it yet.
Survive the Jive breaks it down really well. I definitely encourage you to watch his video on that. But so we see this Merovingian dynasty, and of course his children are Christians, and he is spreading Christianity by force. Not as ruthless as his descendant, one of his most infamous descendants that we all know the name of. But he did spread Christianity. He did have people convert. He did fight other Germanic tribes, conquered them, and had them convert to Christianity. Shortly after the Merovingian dynasty dies out, in the very heart of Germania itself arises the Carolingians, which are descendants of the Merovingian dynasty as well. But they take control, and if anybody knows their history, the Carolingians, they are the bloodline of Charlemagne himself. Now, I know you know that name, right, Anthony?
We're talking about Charlemagne the God, right?
The rapper?
Yeah. No, Charlemagne you're talking about Charlemagne the Roman. Wasn't he a Roman emperor?
Oh yeah, he brought the Holy Roman Empire to Europe. Charlemagne was the most prolific person in the history of Europe. He changed the course of our faith. He changed the course of our history. He was ruthless. I've already mentioned the massacre of Verdun, where he slaughtered near 7,000 Jarls from various Saxon tribes that he was battling against. And when I say massacre, I don't mean that in the sense of he went to battle and they fought bravely and he massacred the other army. I mean that he, by duplicitous means, massacred 7,000 Jarls of the Saxon tribes. And he did this in the dark of the night. During a peace treaty, when the Saxons and Charlemagne's forces were to meet the next day for negotiations of peace. So under all conventions of law of the time, not just Germanic law, but also Roman law, there were not to be any violence until after that meeting and decisions were made. However, breaking conventions, Charlemagne seized the opportunity in the dark of the night and sent his forces into the camps of the Saxons and massacred them.
Yeah, that checks out. I mean, you see a similar thing with who the Catholics call Saint Olaf, Olaf Tryggvason. Broke all the laws in the land, freaking spreading Christianity.
Well, you know, there was a Jarl by the name of Vidukund that was able to go around and spread the news of what Charlemagne had did to the other Saxons. And he was trying to raise an army up to against them, since pretty much almost every Jarl of the time that was leaders was just killed. And Charlemagne and his forces hunted him down. And there's various stories on what happens to Vidukund. Some say that he converted according to the Catholic history of events. Vidukund converted and was baptized and lived a great life. Went town to town preaching Christianity. The alternative history, which I subscribe to in this specific instance, is that actually Charlemagne's forces were able to capture Vidukund. He refuses to convert to Christianity. They essentially torture him until he does eventually accept it, just with his mouth, verbally. They baptize him. They keep him as a prisoner, and they essentially take him from town to town, to village, and parade him around and tell people this is what will happen to you if you don't convert. So there are historical documents that attest this version of events, but it is disputed. But I find that more likely than not, because that was his MO, that was his method of operating.
I mean, I don't think that a guy would witness a slaughter like that, go around, try to build up an army, and then all of a sudden convert because he saw the light.
Well, you know, and the thing is that there's really no evidence that prior to the Merovingians that there were missionaries in what we know as Germania today, until the Merovingians came. And then their lines in the Roman Empire, the Alemanni, the Boulevari. But when Charlemagne comes, it's by sword and it's by force.
By sword and by fire.
I think that if we actually did a critical analysis of the timeline of events that happened, that contrary to what is popular among historians, what we'll actually find is that there was a coordinated war and coordinated attacks and retaliations by the Saxons and other Germanic tribes against Charlemagne. We have the rise of Ragnar Lothbrok, and everybody knows Ragnar Lothbrok from obviously the Viking show. That was not historically accurate, as I'm sure most people listening to this know. But what happens is 10 years after the slaughter of the Saxon Jarls by Charlemagne, Ragnar Lothbrok, his very first mission, his very first act, is to sack Paris. Paris was Charlemagne's center of power. And so by doing that, and it can't be just for fame and glory, it's more to it. They just don't write it in the history books. But I know it in my soul to be true. I know it in my soul that these honorable folk of ours are just like us today. During this time, when you have a empire that's expanding and essentially killing families and men and taking the women and forcing conversion by sword or death, that there's something in the soul that I know to be true, that Ragnar Lothbrok's time that he rose up to sack Paris because this was a coordinated attack. Wars aren't always battles that happen consistently day after day against people. It's maneuvers. It takes time to build armies. There's various tactics that are used. And although 10 years passed, I firmly believe that attack and the sacking of Paris was the retaliation of the massacre of Verdun by Charlemagne.
Yeah, you slaughtered our jarls. We're going to destroy your seat of power. You're not going to, you got away with it once. You're not going to do it again.
Yep, that's exactly it.
Or we're going to do our damnedest to make sure you can't do it again.
And while all this is happening in continental Europe, the Saxons and the Danes and the Germanic folk, they're migrating north. They're sailing overseas. They're seizing lands in England as we know it today. And they're essentially, some people are fleeing for a better life in a different place. To get out of this persecution and this treacherous war, after losing a huge amount of jarls that were leaders of the folks, that were priests to the folk. And it wasn't even very long after that migration started taking place. We see it really heavily in the 700s, 800s, 900s, the quote-unquote Viking era. That's what that was. They were going and finding new lands. They were finding new places to live, to take their families, to raise them. They were essentially fleeing persecution. Now, England was not a safe haven for them at all either. And although the Saxons were the last to officially convert of the major tribes of Germania, it wasn't very long after Charlemagne, just a couple hundred years had passed. And then we have the rise of William the Great, or excuse me, William the Conqueror was his name. He himself is also a descendant of Charlemagne and had the very same imperial mission that Charlemagne, his forebearer, had. And he was the one that conquered England and set up the Christian rule throughout all of England.
Now that's what I call playing the long game.
So it took almost 1,000 years for the conversion of the Germanic people to this foreign religion. 1,000 years. That's how long that battle raged. And then when that battle was over, when the Christians ruled all the lands, and shortly after England, you have the Icelanders and people migrating to the new lands, in Norway being the last to convert and such, Sweden and all of those. But you still had individuals that still practiced the old ways. But then, shortly after, there's no more kingdoms to conquer and convert to Christianity. There's no more tribes to conquer to convert to Christianity. Now we see the persecution of individuals, the Inquisition. The Roman priests are now the ecclesiastical authorities in various townships. And they're the ones that control the people. And if you got out of line, you would be essentially brought to trial.
These are the histories that nobody wants to talk about and most willfully ignore.
Very true. And, the one thing about us talking about this tonight, and I hope I've done an okay job at explaining this history. It's so hard with so much information, and there's a lot of little things and that happens at different times, and some of it's related and some of it's not. But it's that context of knowing why that number 9 is at that mile marker there. It's the context to that. And I think it's really important that our folk understand this history because it affects us so greatly today. And many people listening, I hope you share this history with your families. Maybe share this specific episode of our podcast with your families that are still Christian. And they want to understand the history of how this happened because they don't know. They just think it was some, bright and loving God that sent his son and he died for our sins and we did this. And then Christianity was just spread by pious missionaries and saints, and that's not the history at all. It was a bloody conversion that took over 1,000 years to attain. And the story is not over yet. The story continues to go. And over the last 50 years, our folk, well, really, I can go back further than that. For the last 150 years, our folk have been waking up. Our folk have been trying to connect to our ancestors and our gods and our history of who we are as a people. And today, luckily, we have the internet with all of its vices and wrongs and all the harm it does to our society. It does have a good purpose in the sense that we can spread this information among each other. I encourage all of you to do that. Anthony, do you have any parting thoughts for us?
I'm sure this is a topic we'll bring up again on various occasions in different ways. I definitely intend to be a little bit more educated by the time we get to that point. Listening to this, I got a couple points in history that I need to read up on and pay more attention to. Thank you for taking the lead on this. This was definitely your drive. But I feel you articulated your points and your perspectives very well.
Context is more important than perspective, and that's really what my point is.
You articulated your context extremely well. I don't know, like just with that last little bit, it kind of drew to mind something I find myself saying at certain periods of time, that to a lot of people it's not what it actually is, it's what it appears to be. And we need to get back to what it actually is, not just worrying about how it looks. I don't know if that quite makes sense.
No, it makes absolute sense. And I would say that same message for not just understanding the history, but also understanding our faith. You know, that alphabet soup paganism that people are practicing. And you have to connect the dots. You have to put the whole story together to have the whole context. And the same goes for people that believe in like the archetypes of our gods, or people that believe very deep things about our gods because of what they perceive to be sporadic information in all these different places, and they're not able to understand what that mile marker is. And that's what I'm trying to do with this show, Anthony. That's what we try to do with our conversations and all of our episodes. And I hope in this episode that we've detailed this very clearly for everybody, and that you understand what this mile marker is. And I would encourage you to understand more than just the history. Go back to our first episode, start there, and start understanding the context of our faith. Because we've detailed over the last 15 episodes what our faith is. It is not an alphabet soup faith.
It is not a pick and choose what feels good and ignore those bits that challenge you. All right, everybody, this has been The Sacred Stew. I am Anthony. My co-host is James. Y'all have a good night.